Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making the Rounds. I know it's a weird title, no one really knows why it applies to everything we're making now, it just does. The point is, we're going to talk about the LPL, not the LPL. Well, the LPL is involved tangentially, and I watch the LPL stream, so this is where this is coming from. But we're going to talk about the World Championship group draws and our reactions to them, what we think about them. We're probably going to avoid stuff like regional strength and what these teams did at MSI, what these teams did at last year's Worlds, what these teams did at Rift Rivals, because no one cares, because these aren't the same teams, this isn't the same tournament, and a lot of stuff has changed. So, first we're going to do a brief reaction to the play-in thing. I personally don't feel super qualified to talk about the wildcard teams. If I do, it'll be from a perspective of these are the Pool 1 teams. This is what you should focus on to beat them. Have fun, kids. But Emily might be able to have a little bit more to say.
Yeah, so the team that I can speak to the most is Team 1, who was actually not the team that I was expecting to come out of Brazil. And they're in a group with C9 and Direwolves. Now, I feel like this is about as good of a group as any for them. For example, if they'd been placed in a group with Lion, I would have actually worried about them a lot more because they, I feel like a team like Lion that really focuses on strong laning and has some mechanically talented players would match up really well against Team 1 actually, because they're kind of more of a team that understands the game better than a lot of other teams in Brazil, but might not have the star players in each position that you would kind of want going to an international event like this, just because the level of individual play alone is a lot higher than it is in Brazil as a region. I don't see them beating C9. And I actually don't see any group where a Pool 1 team doesn't make it out.
Okay.
At all. The closest would be, I would think,
Group D, maybe?
Group D, yeah. But again, so I'm not super qualified to talk about Rampage or Fenerbahce because I haven't watched them. People who watch Japan say that Rampage is good, but I don't know what that means or their play style at all. I need to go back and watch Turkey a bit because I've heard a lot of great things about this team. I know Frozen has been performing really well. And then HK, Hong Kong Attitude, I need to watch more of them as well. So I don't know if, Kelsey, you can speak to them at all. But
Hong Kong Attitude, I'm a little apprehensive about because I feel like they get away with a lot of stuff. I was watching the Gauntlet final, and there was legit a moment where it was the jungler was Gragas, so the jungle matchup was Driven Gragas, and Gragas can theoretically still have pressure in this matchup. It was Gragas with Maokai. So this is a lane where it's not necessarily going to win the 2v2 super hard against Renekton Jarvan, but it's easy to get, if the Renekton is diving the turret, it's easy to catch him with Maokai Gragas. It's real easy to turn this type of engage. Renekton legit spends the entire game proxy farming between the tier 1 and tier 2 turret for Maokai, and Gragas and Maokai do nothing. They're just like, oh, we've never encountered this before. How did we deal with this problem? Difficult to say that HK are a team that stomps. I think their drafts are really good. I think they had a really strong read on the meta for 7.16. Obviously that changes. They're really good at being able to transition their lane leads into river control and stuff like this. I actually think their wards are fairly well, so I actually think in terms of dimensionality, because AHQ really only have one way of playing the game, HK is probably the stronger LMS team. So I kind of, I see where you would be high on Fenerbahce, but it's just kind of sad then that they're in a group where they have to deal with HKA. I think they might even do better against C9 because C9 are super inconsistent, but we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, I still think based on, I need to watch more Fenerbahce just because I've heard so many good things about them. I still think it's going to be HK and FB making it out of this group. I actually don't know who's going to make it second out of Group C. I think Fnatic will make it out. Young Generation, I've only watched one series of them versus Ascension, and I didn't think either team was particularly strong. And then I haven't watched any of KLG. Though the group that everyone's looking at is WE, Gambit, and Lion. Lion drew an unlucky group here because I think in a lot of other groups they would have been able to make it out as a second seed. But against Gambit and WE, I don't really see that happening.
Obviously, Gambit WE is the historic matchup. Chinese fans thought the Season 2 final would be WE versus M5. So I think it's an interesting situation. Obviously, Edward was like, "Why? Why do we?" WE are a really interesting and difficult team to prepare for because I think that they're one of the few teams where they just do a ton of different things, right? And they have the ability to actually and have practice doing, like, we'll play this scaling teamfight comp, we'll play this 1-3-1 comp, we'll do double TP, we'll do this, like, Shen Talia lane, and we'll be really good at juggling aggro and low health teamfights so that Tristana doesn't get reset. They have pretty good setup for Baron. They have pretty good understanding of when to transition waves. I would say one of the biggest issues with them is just knowing when to play to pressure and when to lane gank in the early game. So that's, for me, one of their most exploitable parts. So if you have an extremely aggressive jungle strategy and can take advantage of the fact that Mystic will just, like, think he's better than everyone, I think in a lot of situations you can upset WE, so even in play-in.
I mean, I'm looking at who. So I'm assuming, like, basically, I rank WE higher than EDG.
I think most
and I think that it'll be like a monstrous upset if they do not make it out. I can't think of another team, and I cannot think of another Pool 1 team that, or like, I can't think of any of these teams actually that would be able to exploit that jungle,
part of the
thing early.
Part of the issue is that he's probably the best jungler in play-in is probably Condi. So,
yeah.
Since he is one of probably the best junglers at the tournament as well, so even though I think that they somehow have issues as a team, like abusing that and playing to pressure, I think it's still unexploitable weaknesses. Anyway, so that's kind of the highlights of that group. Let's talk about Group A then. I think the thing that's interesting about Group A, obviously, is Edward Gaming. If you want to be in a group with Edward Gaming, you have to be either H2K, AHQ, or SK Telecom. Obviously, you can't let other teams in to play against UDG. I think this is like almost kind of a one and done group because the teams that can get into this group are either C9 or Fnatic. I mean, I want to say the problem is that EDG are very focused on getting turret so much that the player that they'll get the lane lead on is Scout, and then they'll just give up the lane lead and they'll give up farm on Scout and they'll give up mid control to make sure they take bot tier 1 first.
Yes.
And then rotate their duo lane all over the map and try to just get this first ring of turrets and then get jungle control. Clearlove has a really abusable champion pool, so like there are a lot of really, really glaring holes in the way that EDG play. Like glaring, gargantuan, like let me just dig into and make a home in there. Like I've got some knickknacks to hang on the wall. Just like there's really abusable weaknesses in EDG, and there are always abusable weaknesses in EDG. So yeah, they're definitely a world where even AHQ, as terrible as they look, like could make it out over them. So
well, and then C9 and Fnatic are the likely like one of those two teams is going to come in. And before we started recording, I was like, I don't think EDG make it out, depending on who ends up in their group. But then you pointed out it had to be C9 or Fnatic, and I started thinking about how I feel about all three of those teams and AHQ, and I'm like, God, they all have major issues coming into this. Like specifically C9, I was really unimpressed with their series against CLG. I know it was really hyphy, and there were a lot of kills. It was not a good series, and I don't think it didn't give me a lot of confidence in their team coming into this event. And I mean, even so, I think SKT makes it out, but I still think that they have a lot of issues as well. Obviously, Edward Gaming is not going to be the team to exploit their top lane problem.
Oh my god, and EDG's team fighting is terrible. Holy shit. Anyway, continue. I'm just thinking of all the terrible things about EDG. Go ahead.
I'm thinking of a team that could exploit SKT's top lane issue. Even though Ziv has not looked particularly super strong, I still think that he is a very strong top laner. So I actually do see a world where AHQ could beat SKT in a best of one. I don't think it's impossible. I still don't think it's very likely, just because I don't think HQ are a particularly strong team in general. But just because of that mismatch, like a team that can exploit SKT is a team that can focus around their top laner. And obviously that's not EDG, but it can be HQ if they prep and play it correctly in a best of one.
Yeah, I think and HQ have come out with some really interesting top line centric strategies like the Yasuo and Tanar. So they can definitely prepare one-off stuff that can be really punishing. That Yasuo composition was really fun. I don't know, I can't get over it. But cause they had Callista and they had all these knockups, it was really cool. But yeah, so for me, HQ is probably the team that plays most, like, if you're thinking about, like, Longju as a team that had SKT's number because SKT's bot lane did nothing while they snowballed the top lane, I think HQ is probably the team most likely to do something like that in this group, even counting Fnatic and Cloud9. So
actually, HQ are pretty well prepared against EDG as well, aside from the fact that, as far as I still know, they are fairly close and scrim each other.
Yeah.
So it's one of the reasons why, like, EDG has said they feel really comfortable going up against HQ, even though stylistically, if they were maybe a slightly better team, HQ would be able to, again, exploit those weaknesses that EDG has in their own top lane.
Well, I think with EDG, its top lane has become more of a 2v2 because they've acknowledged that Mouse is gonna die unless you gank for him, like, in the first 3 minutes of the game. So Clearlove has gotten a lot better at kind of propping him up, and then he's better at just kind of letting the lane go and going for 2Bs in bot. But the problem is that I think the way to beat EDG now is just whenever they go bot, you just go mid, and you get better. You get a much better trade by going mid, almost in like 99% of cases. So
that's a good call because they're obsessed with that bot lane tier 1.
And they'll have such, if they don't go bot, like usually they'll have a pretty good handle on mid control. So that's just a really easy way to destabilize them. Though they do play a lot of mid champs that are mobile, so they don't get that screwed if you take their tier 1. But yeah, I think that that's because SKT are going to play much more to mid pressure and everything else. Even if you sacrifice their bot lane, I think that SKT can react well. And just, I don't really see EDG beating SKT. So yeah, for me, it's EDG is an easy kind of. I don't see HQ beating EDG for that reason as well, because I don't think they'll put a lot of pressure on mid either. They're much more of a side lane team.
Yeah.
So I do think SKT EDG are kind of favored, but I could even see Cloud9 and Fnatic upsetting them. So I mean, EDG, Cloud9 are very good at playing reactively. Fnatic probably won't pressure mid, but their bot is like really strong. Soaz can really abuse their top, so they can probably exert enough pressure inside lanes. This is a really good meta for Fnatic to theoretically go up against SKT as well. But yeah, I don't see. So I see a world where Fnatic or Cloud9 can theoretically beat EDG, but I think they get out over HQ for sure. Let's talk about Group B.
Group B. Woo!
Yay.
Okay. So Immortals must be super happy about this group right now, I think. Sure. Because I as much as people and like I like the Marines. I really have enjoyed watching them previously. This is a different team of Marines, first of all. But then secondly, I just don't think that this is the other group, right? That WE could end up in theoretically, but it would.
It's the way it works. WE could end up in theoretically, but if all Pool 1 teams get out, they can only go to Group D.
They can only go to Group D. So there's like a slim chance that WE could make it into this group, in which I'd say Longzhou WE. Right now, I would say Immortals Longzhou, especially since the probability that WE would have to get seeded in here is very low. Longzhou are the obvious favorites in this group. I don't see either of these two teams being able to exploit Longzhou. I think one of the things, so everyone is talking about Longzhou and they're bringing up their top lane because Khan had this really amazing carry performance in the finals, and I think people are really underselling the Longzhou bot lane.
Yeah, I think the only reason it worked is because they're bot lanes.
Yeah, so basically, like, the main issue that I think teams are actually going to run into with Longzhou is not keeping Khan down, but trying to face the pressure and bot that they're going to have from Prey and Gorilla. Because it's actually really difficult to keep up with. Just ask SKT in the finals series. So that's where I really see a lot of mismatches. Everyone's going to hype up, or I think a lot of people are going to hype up the Flame versus Khan matchup because people are like, oh man, like they're talking about Khan like Flame used to be, where he was like the primary carry of the team and they funneled all their resources to Flame. But that's not actually how Longzhou plays, in my opinion. I think the way you exploit Longzhou is actually by exploiting their jungle, because Cuz is the very obvious weak point on that team. If you saw how SKT did win the one game they had, I know everyone likes, again, to focus on Huni because he came up with this really like phenomenal carry performance. But the reason why he was able to do that is because Blank absolutely dumpstered Cuz. Like, there were a lot of opportunities in game one for Peanut when he was in to exploit the Zac Gragas matchup, and he didn't. And Blank came in and did like pretty much everything right that you'd want to do against a Zac who is really vulnerable in his early routes, and Cuz did not know how to react. Like, it was to the point where Blank was just in his jungle killing him constantly. And I think that's how you attack Longzhou, if you can either somehow manage to destabilize BDD in the mid lane, which is pretty hard, or you get a grip on Cuz really early and then continuously exploit his weaknesses in the jungle. That's actually something that I can see Xmithy doing, but I don't think the rest of the team, particularly the bot lane, is strong enough to hold up to Longzhou's side lanes.
I mean,
if that
the significant thing for me for SKT Longzhou is that SKT just draft weak lanes, and if you draft weak lanes, you're not going to get the push against Longzhou, and if you don't get the push against Longzhou, you can't do anything about their jungler. You can't. Like, you can't. You're not going to invade against two pushing lanes. Like, that's why Longzhou always plays strong lanes. Everyone's like, oh, it's because Khan will carry them. It's because their jungler is, like, fucked if they don't. Like, they have to play strong lanes. So I think that that's something that is really important to highlight. And this is actually, even though I don't really see these teams challenging them, this is a really good group to try, right? Because IMT will try to play strong lanes. Gigabyte Marines.
And Xmithy is smart. Like, people don't give him enough credit for how smart he is in terms of like reacting to opposing jungle routes. He's like uses his experience really well.
The one thing that I kind of hesitate with on Xmithy is that I feel like he has a tendency to go single camps only and then immediately try to do a gank or something like this, and I feel like he leaves himself extremely vulnerable to counter jungling a lot as well. So I think that that's kind of the sad thing, the sad side of the coin to Xmithy. But I do think that he is someone who will be in the enemy jungle if possible. He's really vision oriented, so lanes will at least always know where Cuz is in this kind of matchup if they get a couple of winning lanes or a winning side of the map that they can trade to. The other thing is just like Gigabyte Marines will be a really aggressive team. I would love to see Fnatic in this group, so everyone is just like trying to kill each other at level 3. Like it would be a super fun group to watch, you know? I actually would really enjoy that. So
yeah, that would be a really fun group. I'm wondering if Marines are going to do their lane swap thing again.
Maybe. I mean, this guy Tinakun, the coach, is always saying like, I believe there's a different way to play the game. Like, you don't have to play the rules. It's like, and if you watch their games, they never transition their words properly. Like, they do not give a shit, right? Like, if they're supposed to be there or not, or who's supposed to be there, they're just gonna go. And it's really bad play, but it surprises people a lot. So if you're not prepared for Gigabyte Marines, you can't lose.
That's tough if Fnatic get placed in this group, but I would still say Longzhu IMT making it out.
Yeah, I think.
Because like C9, I'm not saying there's not a world where Fnatic couldn't make it out of this group, because I definitely think there is. But like C9, I'm also not super sold on Fnatic either coming out of their regional. So
yeah, I think
I'm a little bit more confident in them than I am.
I will
C9,
say that Fnatic's bot lane would like really be a strong point of pressure if they get a good matchup. And the fact that NA teams are willing to leave Tristana open a lot more than EU teams, like that's kind of worrying. I think that Fnatic have a really good grasp on like when to trade for Jarvan, Tristana. They have a really good grasp on what lanes they can get, like when they can give up top pressure at least. So they're really good at like what side lane to play to. And Broxa though, but he got better a lot.
We have some
in the
interesting jungle matchups actually, because like if Fnatic did make it to this group, it would be Broxa, Cuz, and then Xmithy, Levi, which Levi is like the obvious like one of these things doesn't belong because he is not a similar jungler to any of the other three.
Yeah, I would actually say that he and Smithy will always play to pressure better than Brox and Cuz though. Let's talk about Group C then.
Woo!
So this is the G2 group because they're the pool 1 team, you know, but G2, Samsung, RNG, and to be determined. I actually think it has to be either C9, HKA, or
a wildcard team if there's an upset. I think whoever makes it into this group is screwed. I think that it's a really tough draw for G2. I
think because G2 are bad at best of ones, this becomes a lot more difficult. And if they don't have a good grasp on the meta going into the group, as they haven't had a good grasp on the meta at MSI, or Last Worlds, or the previous MSI, or even a grasp on how to play the game at the last 2 events, then I do think that this becomes a lot trickier for them if they don't get a good grasp going into this Worlds.
I also think that there are some similarities that you could point out in what G2 want to do with Trick and what Samsung end up doing with Ambition. And I think that makes G2 actually really they are poorly matched against Samsung because I think Samsung does a lot of the things that G2 really want to do, but executes them a lot better. And I know that, I mean, towards the end, I think G2 had a little bit better understanding of how to use Trick and Trick getting involved with like mid and other things around the map. But I don't see them, like, I just think Samsung is better in the areas that G2 really want to be good. I also think that in a similar fashion, Samsung, if they find themselves like at a disadvantage early, I don't think there's a better team in terms of holding out and trying to find a way to win or like claw themselves back in later, especially because of the way that they draft and the way they use ambition in the jungle. I also think that this is Cuvier's year to shine because very low key, like, you know, everyone was talking about KT, they were talking about SKT, they were talking about Longzhu's Khan, but very low key, Cuvier has been having a career split, and I've actually been super impressed with him. So in the games where Samsung was really struggling earlier this year, Cuvier was a lot of the reason why they might end up winning, even if they looked really sloppy. So I think provided that they play ambition, they should be fine making it out of this group. I don't see why they'd play Haru, but they have been known to just throw him in there. I still question that decision, but whenever you ask a team about that, the answer is always scrims. So analytically, I think it would be a stronger decision to start ambition.
I think the one caveat I would say to that is that Crown had a really good spring, but a really lukewarm summer. And I think that the way that G2 obsess over mid control in the mid lane 2v2 and Trick is mid, even when it's a bad time for him to be mid, and it could be a way for them to open the map a bit. And then if Mithy is able to get some good roams and some good map control on the bot side, I think that that's another opportunity, because I do think that the G2's bot lane will be strong going into this tournament. Mithy has been doing a lot better than he was for the rest of the year. Like, his Alistar has been really fantastic, so I think that that's something to look forward to if he can play those types of more playmaking style champions rather than the mage picks. So I
think that's actually where Samsung run into a problem with RNG, because I have also not been impressed with Crown. I think he's had a really rough split, and I think usually if there's like a really significant destabilization of the mid lane, it kind of throws everything else into question. So if RNG, if Xiaohu just flat out like demolishes Crown, that definitely stymies a lot of things that Samsung like to do, especially since ambition is first and foremost a power farming jungler. So I think that's where I'm really curious to see how they match up against RNG, because I still see Crown as kind of a weak point right now.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting aspect of, like, they do get C9 or HKA. I think both Mission and Jensen are good options to go on. Like, you could theoretically have a group with a lot of good mids, and then Crown really has to, like, we know he has that form in him, right?
Yeah.
So he really has to kind of dig deep, and that would be something that they could all look at. So for me, I think this is a good group for RNG, because I think that if RNG are able to get good leads, they're actually able to ride them out and close out well now, which distinguishes them from a lot of early game focused teams that are really like, oh yeah, now we're gonna greed for this turret and completely throw repeatedly. I think RNG are
I can think of a few teams
RNG had that problem, I think, at Spring, and they identified it and worked on it to focus much more on mid, so that if you always have mid control and you default to going mid when you're behind and all this other shit, then they know they have like a way out. When they're screwing up in a side lane, then they have a way out. So I think that this is something that RNG have been good at. Like, Ming and Xiaohu are really the core of this team, which is why people aren't talking about UZI as much when they talk about RNG right now. But of course, like, UZI can have a shitty split, have a shitty season, and then he can, like, get smashed in the LPL final and show up to Worlds, and everyone's like, you said this guy was bad, Kelsey. Like, so...
like last year, yeah.
My expectation is that the UZI Ming Sven Mithy matchup will be really fun. So I think that's, like, RNG have a window where you could almost see them getting out first in this group. Especially since group stage has traditionally been where, like, RNG show up with some crazy shit, you know, and do really well.
Yeah, in best of ones.
And again,
they end up coming up with some interesting strategies.
We said we wouldn't talk a lot about like their historical Worlds performances, but I think this is true of them domestically in the LPL as well, is that they'll have like really good individual game strats or really good identification of champions. Like, okay, they had this really good Ezreal into... Was it Ezreal into... Fuck, who was it? Ezreal into Tristana thing in the final. And it kind of worked. And they're like, okay, this isn't that good, but it kind of worked because it surprised them, and they did really well in the first game from it. So I think that there are a lot of things that as RNG will come to group stage with that are surprising and that make them like a really, really strong best of one team overall, whereas G2 is a really kind of weak best of one team. So there is a world, in my perspective, where RNG actually come out first in this group, where they just like completely blindside Samsung first week, and then Samsung beat them second week, but RNG like beat everyone else. So I think that there is a world where that happens. So I think it's it's an interesting.
I can definitely see that happening because Samsung even last year, the loss everyone was pointing to was their loss to TSM, where they drafted it wasn't that it was like bad, it was just not a typical Samsung draft for that team. And then afterwards they came out and they were like, yeah, we're not going to do that again, we're just going to play what we're comfortable with and play meta. And after that they were fine. But this is a team even in LCK that we've seen sometimes isn't like super quick to pick up the new meta. So usually they end up being fine. I mean, I think it's going to be Samsung RNG coming out. Sure. I do agree that there's a world where RNG exits first, though.
Yeah, I think
this should be really interesting. This is the most interesting group.
I think if there's a group where the Korean team doesn't get out first, it's this one. I think that's a pretty safe thing to say.
Yeah.
But it's kind of sad because I feel like G2 and Samsung will both be better in the best of 5 stage. So we'll have like much better quarterfinals if G2 get out. So in that regard, I kind of hope G2 get out. I still think RNG can play best of 5s all right, but I would have much more faith in G2. So yeah, and we talked a little bit about HK, C9. Is there anything additional? Like, do you think that there are ways that C9 or HK do well?
I'm not sure about HK because again, I don't know. I have to go review their VODs. C9, I hate saying like, well, they have the potential to do this, but like that's kind of what it is for me right now. Like, I don't think this is a team that is playing to the best of their ability, even in their especially in their most recent victory. I think hopefully they can boot camp and really revisit a few things, specifically, so like against Dignitas, back when they lost in playoffs, I think a huge issue with them was that they had so mid-season, all the players came out and they said that they had this great epiphany about how to play proactively and that they weren't going to sit back and do nothing early, and it was going to be great. And then we did not see that in playoffs. And then against CLG, it was like they were trying to split the difference, and Contracts is doing these like weird invades without any support, and it was like watching them back in spring. And I was just like, what is going on? Like, I don't know what this team is doing. So hopefully, I would say like if they get a good boot camp in, if they revisit why they were struggling with those kind of things, I think it's actually not a bad meta for them. I think that if they can also revisit how to play a little bit more through impact, that would be a good strategy for them as well. I still don't think against
Impact QV rematch. QV wins again. Yay!
I still don't think against Samsung and RNG that they would be able to make it out of this group. Like, it'd be it's a rough group for anyone coming into this.
I think C9 are kind of funny because you mentioned like they play a lot more scaling, like team fighting comps, and then you watch this. You also mentioned the CLG series. It's like, oh, this is why, because when they try to play more like laning oriented stuff, they end up like someone ints topside, and then Jensen has to make some kind of weird hero play to make sure they don't get the Baron. He gets the 5-man Cassiopeia ult and dies, and then C9 can't do anything for a while, and then it's like they're really good at this kind of clutch like hero play shit. Like Sneaky could do it really well as well, and though like Impact was doing some crazy shit, and it's just like they don't have to if they just play the game correctly in the first place, So I think that's kind of why they play like safer. Just push the lane, because their coordination early is still like really, oh, I'm gonna do this thing top, but why? What's the rest of my team doing? I don't know. Like, so yeah, I guess that's my issue with C9, and I feel like these aren't G2 and Samsung aren't teams you want to fall behind against, because
no.
If you fall behind them, it's kind of like FF, and RNG is really good at abusing that kind of early game indecision. So yeah, I think it's really difficult for C9. HKA, I think if they get a good draft, it's like Rurus is doing really well. It's kind of an odd situation. You remember
Which is weird,
Rurus?
Yeah. He's been around for forever.
Yeah, he's their top laner, and he was always kind of doing weirdly well in LSPL too, and I was just kind of like, what's happening here? And now he's on HKA and he's doing pretty well. They got the new jungler. Like, God Kwai is like a really weird choice for a jungler as well. But it's like kind of like these weird guys that people forgot about on a team suddenly. And hey, I mean, they're the ones who are doing really well. Like, I guess the rule that Tabe had when he came in was the highest ranked player in each position on this roster in Korean solo queue is the one that's going to play. Like, full stop. It doesn't matter.
Wow.
That's what's happening. And so, like, there was this really good hyped like prodigy mid laner that got replaced by Mission because Mission had a higher Korean rank, and this guy's just like, screw you, I'm going home. And now this is the team, but like Mission has been doing really well, so
yeah. That's hilarious. I didn't know that.
So HK have been doing really well like on individual level, and they pull it together in mid game well around dragon fights and stuff like this. So I think they will be underrated, for sure, I think. Wherever. Do I see them getting out of this group? Not really, so. Okay.
We have Flashholes, Misfits, TSM, and question mark, which is, like...
most likely to be WE.
Yeah, if everything goes according to plan, it will be Team WE.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So I don't know if you... I mean, that changes the makeup of the group, so I'm just going to talk about this group as if Team WE is already in it, just because I think that's the most likely scenario.
WE versus TSM. The largest fan base in the West versus the largest fan base in the East. Let's go. If one of them doesn't make...
You didn't... Wait, what did... You wanted a somehow... What, WE,
I wanted
TSM.
WE, TSM, and Fnatic, but that's impossible because WE and Fnatic are both third seeds, but yeah.
So you had all the, like, massive fan bases in one.
Mm-hmm. Also, if you had SKT as well, imagine that shit.
Yeah.
Fun times.
So this is the only group without a Korean team, so I think a lot of people are going to be saying it's the easiest. Team WE coming into this group changes everything, though, because like I said, I rate them more highly, and I do EDG, which is China's technical #1 seed. And I'm not sure how much...
I'm kind of worried about them. I don't know. I think it's just because they do random shit sometimes for no... And like, the one game at MSI, for example, where Condi just camp spot, or one game in the regular season against Newbie where they drafted like this really good Ashe comp, but then they realized that the only person they could really target on the enemy team was Tom Kench, because then Tom Kench would just eat everyone. And they're like, oh, I guess we should have thought of this. This is the
thing I was going to ask you, actually, because the thing about Team WE that's really interesting to me is that if they do make it, right, and they're in this group, they will have been on the new patch and playing against teams for a little bit longer than these other teams. And since they are so prone to randomly trying stuff out, do you think like they get that out of their system before they get to this group, or do you think it's going to matter? Because I know like a lot of people, when looking at what happens before Worlds in scrims, there are always these really weird individual metas that develop between scrim groups, especially after groups are drawn, because there are certain teams you obviously don't want to scrim against anymore. And I know that has had an effect previously on groups. So I'm wondering, like, do you think that if they're coming out of play-in, that's going to help them at all?
My understanding...
Because maybe they'll just, like, get it out.
My understanding with WE is that they do actually really well in scrims in general, which is part of what contributes to them thinking that they can play whatever, you know? And they get, like, a bad read on what's good. So one of the best examples of the split was obviously the Rakan Xayah lane, and before people, like, really figured out how to effectively use Rakan, they would all in first rotation red side Rakan Xayah. And then, so you have this first rotation red side Rakan Xayah that your only option is to really, like, win bot lane super hard. And then, because you probably gave up a really good top laner or a really good jungler or something in exchange for this. And so you end up in this situation, and if that goes wrong, then the rest of your comp is probably kind of shit. They had this tendency to go Rakan Xayah Sejuani, right? So they would have a low pressure jungle with like, they would have a scaling jungle or farming jungle with only bot side pressure, and then they would have losing top mid, and it would just, like, there was a period where this was just the bane of WE's existence. And you could tell that it was something that they stuck to because it was doing well for them in scrims, right? You could tell. But then they just kept losing games. It's like, we don't understand what's going on. So this is kind of my fear for WE. I do think that they're one of the most versatile teams, like, full stop, at the entire tournament in terms of stuff that they're able to do. They're able to play well around top, they're able to play well around mid, they're able to play around bot, they're able to play, like, winning lanes and get jungle pressure super well. They can play scaling comps and do really well in team fights, and I think that's what makes them so, like, kind of menacing, is just how very difficult they are to prepare for. And if they get a good strategy, they'll just crush you in best of one, but if they do something, like, really random, then they'll, like, why is this team even at the tournament, you know? Let's first pick Kog'Maw and see what happens. Yay!
They started the trends, didn't
yeah,
they?
I know.
They were
like
the
one
first.
Of the only. Yeah. They're still the only team where they first pick Kog'Maw, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, okay, go ahead.
So the rest of this team, I know a lot of people are down on Flash Wolves. So the thing with Flash Wolves for me is not their prior history, which a lot of people are going to bring up just because they're default the top team in LMS, and no one has changed that for years now. So I feel like to your point that you've said a couple times elsewhere, like, it's not the LMS, it's the Flash Wolves region. I think the thing with me about Flash Wolves right now is that it's not a bad meta for them, but Maple has, even though he is a very strong mid laner, we know that he has the capability to show up. He has not had a particularly good split, in my opinion, and that's something that kind of I can't take out of my mind when going up against a team like TSM, for example, with Bjergsen. That could actually give them a few issues. It's kind of like how you treat Crown with Samsung, where you're like, oh, this player, historically, we know they have the capacity to play at a ridiculously high level, but they have not shown any of that this split. So that's my biggest concern, actually, for Flash Wolves coming in. I think it's a great meta for Sword Art, though, which could like balance it out, because unlike previously with the NL, their problem was always in whether they could unlock Sword Art from the bot lane, and now that they don't have that problem and there are a lot of these tanky initiators that he can play, that's a huge point in their favor.
I think also, like, the other thing that people are kind of, yeah, you mentioned the Sword Art thing. People are expecting them to be like MSI Flash Wolves, and I think a big difference is the support pool. Like, I think that really opens up this team, and people are saying that this is, you can kind of write them off. Like, they're the pool 1 seed, you can kind of write off. But I think they're actually similar to EDG in skill. So, under preparing for Flash Wolves, I think is kind of a mistake in that regard. In terms of, like, what they want to do is similar to EDG, and then the way that they play out is similar to EDG. So I think that I wouldn't underrate them. I think that they aren't necessarily favored to get out, especially if it is TSM and WE, but I actually think they really could. Like, I actually think that they could. I know Flash Wolves actually personally rate W really highly, their players and the team. I think that they lose to them in scrims a lot, so that might be like a mental block or something. But so I think that that's kind of a sad sign, but I think that they could actually theoretically beat TSM even. They're like Misfits. I mean, I also think Misfits will be a little underrated. One thing I think that's interesting about this group is that the junglers aren't bad. Like, you look at the other the junglers in general at this tournament, and they're like, but Karsa, Condi are in this group. Maxler has really showed up really well. He's become, like, in my opinion, the best jungler in Europe. If you only count playoffs, which is obviously dangerous, so I don't do that. But if you only count playoffs, he's the best jungler in Europe. And then TSM's Svenskeren isn't bad. Like, he does well. So I think that this is actually a decent jungle group. And because of that, I think that, like, if you have a good jungler, your team becomes much more well-rounded and much more unpredictable overall. So I think that that's something that people shouldn't really count out about Misfits or Flash Wolves in general, because I think people will kind of write them off. But yeah, I think this group could be competitive, actually.
Yeah, I think the big thing in this group is going to be how so again, assuming WE could go through, how the favored teams, like generally favored teams in this group, so TSM and WE, prepare for Flash Wolves and Misfits. Obviously, if WE play Flash Wolves often in scrims, which it sounds like they do, they should be fairly prepared. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I still think it's tough between TSM and Flash Wolves, actually. I just wish Maple had a good split. Because he's, like, not usually a weak point of that team. And that's the weirdest thing about Flash Wolves going into this, is that Sword Art is in, like, the perfect meta for him, but Maple has been underperforming, which is, I want to say it's the first time they've gone into an international competition where Maple has not had, like, a super strong split.
He's still scarred by that LeBlanc Cassiopeia game, you know.
It just tilted him for an entire split. Faker ruined the Flash Wolves.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because they're also good supports in this group. Ignar, I think Ignar is actually the best support in Europe, based off of this year only. Like, obviously Mithy is the best in general, but I think Ignar was really performed really well. And so we've got Ignar, you've got Sword Art, you've got Biofrost even stepped up in playoffs. So, and then Ben did really well. I actually think there are a lot of good LPL supports. Like, it's weird because everyone talks about how stacked their region is, and, like, mid or AD carry or jungle or top, and I'm just like, yeah, LPL has support.
We have support.
It's good.
I'm still sad that Score is not going to the...
Yeah.
So I think of the junglers that Courier is sending, and I'm like,
Yeah. Anyway, that's kind of the wrap for what we think of the group draw. Thanks everyone for watching. Sorry it ended up being kind of long, but have a good time.